Introduction. This is the first of two videos in a reply to a video by graphic designer Linus Boman entitled How This Font Became the Face of Chinese Food in America. Please note that this is not an attack or takedown. It's a critical reply providing additional context and support for some of the points Linus makes, while correcting some of the other statements made in the video. This video responds to Linus covering these topics. 1. Chinese origin of the chop suey dish. 2. What is real Chinese? 3. Chinese and English writing conventions. 4. Visual features of the chop suey font. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Just a note on pronunciation. I will be using the pronunciation chop suey rather than a phonetically correct pronunciation of the name in its original Cantonese dialect, since I always aim to make my videos accessible to people who are only listening to them rather than viewing them, and chop suey is certainly more readily recognizable than the Cantonese pronunciation of the original Chinese word qiao za sui. Additionally, I'd like to note that I'm very aware this entire subject is one of particular sensitivity to Chinese people, especially members of the Chinese diaspora, and, most importantly, members of the Chinese diaspora living in the US. I'm also aware that there's a wide range of views on this subject among Chinese people, and that opinions on it are typically the product of personal background. Reading the comments on Linus' video, you'll find Chinese people outside the US, even other immigrants in places like Australia, have quite a different view to that of Chinese people living elsewhere. I also want to note that I know what it's like to be an immigrant, twice over in fact. I was a second-generation immigrant in Australia where I was born, and due to my childhood accent, I had to face the usual kind of misidentification, with some people convinced I was born outside Australia. Later in life, I became a first-generation immigrant when I moved to Taiwan, and over the 18 years I have lived here, I have faced the usual questions like, where are you from, and how can you speak Chinese, as well as the usual kinds of microaggressions immigrants typically experience, which I'm not actually concerned by, and some of the macroaggressions immigrants often experience, which have been less easy to dismiss. But I don't think being an immigrant in one country gives someone the right to comment decisively or authoritatively on the issues facing immigrants in other countries. I think immigrants who are affected by specific issues are the people who should be listened to on those topics. Consequently, I don't intend to provide my personal opinion on the current day use of this font, since my personal opinion on that topic is irrelevant. It's really not my place to decide or even opine whether this font is racist or make suggestions about whether or not it should be used. If you came here for my opinion on that subject, this is your notice that you won't hear it. I'm confining my comments to the history of the font's origin and use, and on various statements made in Linus' video about Chinese and English writing conventions, since those are subjects on which I am informed. Chinese origin of the chop suey dish. Linus starts his video thus.
You've probably seen this style of font before, but didn't know what it was called. Probably at a restaurant that sells food like this, in containers like these, with cookies like this. But if you grew up in China, these would be completely foreign. After all, everything I just listed was invented in the USA.
If you grew up in China, you've probably also seen that style of font before. It's sometimes used in China and Taiwan to make signs for English speakers, and I don't mean simply Westerners. Just on a small point, fortune cookies were not invented in the US. They were invented in Japan, brought to the US, and adopted by Chinese immigrants, who then marketed them to unsuspecting non-Chinese Americans as authentic Chinese culture. In the 19th century, there was quite a trend of enterprising businesses in Japan and China creating pseudo-authentic cultural artifacts specifically to appeal to a Western market and selling them as genuine, and this trend continued well into the 20th century. Interestingly, this particular business practice had started as early as the 17th century. That's especially important for the second video in this reply, so I'll save it for then, but I'd like to flag it now. Additionally, the dish we know in English as chop suey wasn't invented in America either. It actually has a centuries-old history in China, where it was invented. According to food historian Andrew Ko, the claim that it was a dish invented in America appears to have originated in 1904, when a Chinese cook from San Francisco told a lawyer that he had invented the dish and that it was not remotely Chinese. This cook, called Lem Sen, asserted that he had invented the dish just before the arrival of Chinese Ambassador Li Hongjiang in America, after which it became immensely popular when it was wrongly reported that Li had favoured the dish. Lem also claimed the recipe had been stolen by an American man and demanded legal compensation. His lawyer threatened New York restaurants with an injunction forbidding them from making the dish, which the restaurants ignored, since, as Coe notes, quote, New Yorkers knew that Len Sem's claim was absurd. They had been eating chop suey on Mott Street for over a decade before Li Hongjiang's visit. End quote. Coe writes that the next year this story was apparently substantiated by a newspaper article quoting several Chinese students at a Boston trade school who likewise insisted chop suey was not Chinese, asserting they had never heard of it, and characterizing it as a cheap imitation of a Chinese dish. Coe says, quote, stories of the chop suey hoax proliferated from then on. The gist of the story was always that the dish was a fraud, invented for Americans too ignorant to recognize real Chinese food, end quote. The fact that so many Americans found it completely believable that their cultural ignorance had caused them to be fooled by such a story is perhaps something of a backhanded credit to their sense of self-awareness. What is real Chinese? Linus continues.
You can tell a chop suey font by the distinctive style of wedge-like shapes supposed to invoke Chinese calligraphy.
This is not quite right. Those shapes were intended to invoke the use of a brush, as is used in Chinese calligraphy, but the strokes and letters were not supposed to invoke or mimic Chinese calligraphy or Chinese characters. This is a distinction which will become very important later. Linus continues.
But I wanted to understand how it looks to someone who knows the nuances of real Chinese.
I just want to point out that the term real Chinese is very loaded, since there are several different forms of Chinese currently used today, all of which could be called real Chinese, even though a couple of them are only used by a fraction of the Chinese literate population. I know what Linus means, and in the context in which he's using the phrase, he's not wrong, but there are actually serious political implications of identifying what constitutes real Chinese, and arguments over those political implications are still ongoing within the Sinosphere. In some places, your view of what constitutes real Chinese can get you into significant trouble. Chinese and English writing conventions. At about 3 minutes in, we hear some comments from Raven Mo, a Chinese designer in New York who collaborated with Linus to provide insight into Chinese language writing conventions from a historical and design perspective. Raven says this.
Our writing system is called Hanzi.
Strictly speaking, Hanzi is only one Chinese character writing system. It is the oldest and most widely used and has undergone many changes, but it isn't the only Chinese writing system. There's also Juyin Fu Hao, which is a Chinese alphabetic script, on screen now. Raven continues.
For each character, there is a very specific order in which it should be written. If a character is made up of 5 strokes, you must write them in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Usually left to right, top to bottom.
As Linus later noted in a comment on the video, this isn't really true. Although there's a general stroke order rule of left to right, top to bottom, the stroke order of Chinese characters has changed over time, since Chinese characters themselves have changed radically over time. And even today, in different regions, Chinese characters are written with a different stroke order. See the examples on screen now. Chinese characters written in Taiwan, China, Korea, and Japan are all written with a different stroke order. Additionally, the older traditional Chinese characters and the newer simplified characters, which use fewer strokes, both use a different stroke order to each other. Raven continues.
There are no such rules within the Latin alphabet.
This isn't true. Stay with me here because I have a lot to say about this extremely common misconception. The Latin alphabet, for want of a better phrase, used by, again for want of a better phrase, English speakers, has had established stroke order rules for over 1,000 years. This is because, just like with Chinese, The stroke order of the Latin alphabet used in Europe was influenced by the tool originally used for writing. Chinese stroke order was influenced by the use of a calligraphy brush dipped in ink, and Latin alphabet stroke order was influenced by the use of an angled stylus, or quill, dipped in ink. Traditional scripts used to write the Latin alphabet in medieval Europe, such as uncial, Carolingian minuscule, Gothic minuscule, and Humanist minuscule, were written using a specific stroke order which is easily identifiable by examining the letters written in them. In particular, the ascenders and descenders, parts of the letter written as the quill moves up and down respectively, show clear evidence of specific stroke order and look totally different if incorrect stroke order is used. These early scripts also had specific strokes, which were practiced individually in order to form each letter correctly, just like in Chinese. For example, Gothic minuscule scripts used a wide range of strokes of very specific shapes for lowercase letters, such as 2 different types of small diamond stroke, called regular and elongated quad, 4 different types of horizontal stroke, called basic, pointed, flat, and reversed flat, and several forms of vertical stroke, with a top or bottom hook, or both. To write in Gothic minuscule scripts, such as textura and rotunda, scribes had to learn at least 10 different stroke types just for lowercase letters, even more than the 8 basic strokes of Chinese characters. And then they had to learn even more stroke types for the capital letters, including 2 verticals, 2 diagonals, 2 rounded strokes, and some decorative strokes. Although these individually styled strokes were discarded by the new scripts which emerged later, with a much smaller range of simpler strokes, specific stroke order for the Latin alphabet was continued from the Renaissance era into the modern era, with the emergence of cursive scripts, such as secretary hand and italic script in the 16th century, round hand in the 17th century, and copperplate in the 18th century. Strict stroke order was also followed by the chord cursive script invented in the US in the mid-20th century and exported throughout the Anglosphere. It used at least 4 individual stroke types and a very specific stroke order. It was taught in Australian schools from the 1950s up to the end of the 20th century. I was taught chord cursive myself, and in school I spent hours on writing exercises, practicing both the individual stroke types and the stroke order. Even today, both the modern cursive and continuous cursive scripts for the Latin alphabet, as used by native English speakers, follow strict stroke order conventions. Printing the Latin alphabet by hand also uses a specific stroke order, and there are countless guides online showing the same modern stroke order for Latin letters which has been standard for decades. When teaching English as a second language, the Latin alphabet is also taught with a strict stroke order, much to the surprise of non-native English speakers who think it's just a collection of unorganized squiggles. Here I speak with the experience of 18 years teaching English in Taiwan. Similarly, Chinese speakers often hold the view that just because English doesn't differentiate grammatical inflection using tones, which Chinese does, English doesn't use any intonation at all. It's just a continuous monotonal drone without any variation. This is also untrue, but given the very different use of intonation in Chinese and English, it's very easy to see how English could sound that way to a native Chinese speaker. Raven continues.
Take a capital E. You can draw the stem first, followed by the 3 bars, or the bar first, followed by the stem. It makes no difference.
It actually does make a difference, which is why English written with the Latin alphabet follows a general top to bottom, left to right stroke order, very similar to Chinese. If you draw the stem of a capital E first and then the 3 bars, the letter will have a specific appearance. But if you draw the 3 bars first and then the vertical stem, the letter will have a different appearance, which is readily visible. This is easy to see when you compare different Latin alphabet fonts which are designed to look handwritten and which have different stroke orders. On screen now you'll see some examples, and you should be able to see the differences in the appearance of the letters which results from different stroke order. In case that's not clear, I'll provide an example myself. On screen now, you'll see a short video of me writing the capital letter E with 3 different stroke orders. Here's the first stroke order, in which I start by writing the long vertical line of the E, top to bottom, then the top horizontal stroke, left to right, the middle horizontal stroke, left to right, and the bottom horizontal stroke, left to right. Here's the second stroke order, in which I start by writing the long vertical line of the E, top to bottom, and then continue it horizontally without lifting my pen from the page, left to right, to create an L shape. Now I lift my pen and write the top horizontal stroke, left to right, then the middle horizontal stroke, left to right. You can see this letter E looks quite different from the first one I wrote. That initial L shape I wrote is very distinct. Here's the third stroke order, in which I start by writing the top horizontal stroke, left to right, the middle horizontal stroke, left to right, and the bottom horizontal stroke, left to right. Now I write the long vertical line of the E, top to bottom. You can see that this letter E looks distinctly different from the other two. It's even more distinctly different due to the difficulty of making the horizontal lines even lengths and connecting them all coherently with the vertical line. When you write the vertical line first and then draw the horizontal lines out of it, the horizontal lines are much easier to line up and make equal lengths, whereas when you do it in the reverse order, you inevitably end up with horizontal lines of different lengths, which often cross over the vertical line. I'm totally unused to writing with this stroke order, so I've really made a mess of it here, with exaggerated horizontal lines and a final letter which looks totally out of proportion and very different to my two earlier efforts. So yes, the Latin or English alphabet has stroke order, and yes, that stroke order really does make a distinct visual difference to the final appearance of the letters, and yes, you can see quite clearly whether the stroke order is optimal or suboptimal in terms of creating the desired shape. Visual features of the Chop Suey font. Raven then goes on to comment on specific visual features of the Chop Suey font in relation to Chinese writing conventions.
In Chinese, the order determines the style to be used. There are 8 strokes in Chinese calligraphy. The character Yong is often used for learning calligraphy because it contains all 8. Dian, Heng, Shu, Gou, Pi, Wan, Pie, and Na. With Chop Suey, you only get the impression of 2 strokes. Na, a forceful stroke, and Ti, a raised stroke.
Yes, with the Chop Suey font, you only get the impression of 2 strokes. However, and here's the important point, it doesn't actually matter. Why? Because Chop Suey font only needs 2 strokes. Again, why? Because it's not trying to mimic Chinese characters or Chinese calligraphy. It's representing what the Latin alphabet looks like when you write it with a brush dipped in ink. Since the letters of the Latin alphabet have so few individual strokes, you don't need all 8 of the traditional strokes of Chinese calligraphy, you only need a couple. This is the point. The Chop Suey font is being used to represent letters in the English alphabet. It has absolutely nothing to do with representing Chinese characters or the Chinese calligraphic writing system. That's a mistake which ironically results from looking at the font from an ethnocentric perspective, separated from the socio-cultural context in which the font emerged. Again, I'll have more to say on this later. Raven continues.
The designer has arranged these shapes in a way that makes no sense to a Chinese reader.
That is correct, but it's okay, because this script was never intended for a Chinese reader. It was intended specifically for English readers of English. It's natural that this makes no sense to a Chinese reader, especially a reader separated by over 100 years from the font's original socio-historical context. Raven continues.
Tian Minliao, a designer who specializes in multi-script typography, points out that the Latin alphabet has many letters that are built from circular shapes, O, B, D, etc. Whereas we don't draw circles in Hanzi at all.
This isn't true, and I'm not saying that as a mere technicality, especially given the very strong claim, quote, we don't draw circles in Hanzi at all, end quote. Curves, loops, and circles are drawn frequently when writing Hanzi in cursive script. The cursive script is full of them. See the examples on screen now. It's the same when people are writing Chinese casually by hand, even without attempting a cursive script. They often use curves and loops. At this point, it's important to differentiate between elite and popular writing forms. When people are writing Hanzi in everyday life, they aren't concerned with carefully balanced geometry, well-planned stroke weight, and all the other features important to Hanzi written in a scribal context. It's true that elite writing forms of Hanzi aim to follow these very strict conventions of style and beauty, but popular Hanzi writing forms, the writing of Chinese by ordinary people in everyday life, don't. Concerns over these features of Hanzi writing are the concerns of the elite, not those of the ordinary people. An excellent example of awareness of this distinction was shown by Chinese linguist Ni Haishu, who was influential in the Maoist Chinese character simplification project. Historian Hayo Fröhlich writes that when addressing the question of is it necessary to write characters well, quote, his basic answer was not really, end quote. Fröhlich continues, quote, while Ni conceded that the art of the ancient calligraphers might still be an attractive model to emulate, workers, peasants, and soldiers had other things to do than practice their handwriting, end quote. On screen now is an image of handwritten Chinese by Mao Zedong himself. You'll note that it's not what anyone would call neat, with disproportionate strokes and characters of wildly different sizes, even within the same word, without any regard for traditional scribal conventions. Now, this is absolutely not because Mao was a bad writer or had literacy issues. On the contrary, this is perfectly natural and normal handwritten Chinese. People writing Chinese casually by hand in everyday life tend to write the characters in a very loose and messy way without any attention to the strict aesthetic requirements of the elites, and they still make themselves understood. See the examples on screen now. There are also Chinese fonts created by Chinese designers which deliberately replace traditional lateral strokes in Hanzi with curved and circular strokes. See the examples on screen now, such as Zhulang Yuanti, one of these kinds of curved fonts which is used in Taiwan. There are also other kinds of modern Chinese fonts, often designed to be playful or childlike, such as 可爱的大象字体 on screen now, which commonly use large curves and circles. Not only do native Chinese speakers read these fonts perfectly easily, non-native Chinese speakers, such as myself, are expected to find them legible as well. Fortunately, this isn't much of a problem when you're an immigrant surrounded by a wide range of Chinese fonts, instead of only seeing the stylized calligraphic fonts representing the way elites think Chinese ought to be written. So, Chinese characters don't suddenly become illegible when you start writing them with curved strokes, and all those concerns about brushstroke weight and proportion, character size, ink density and balance are entirely negotiable or even completely disposable when making a creative, non-traditional Chinese font. It's important not to fossilize Hanzi and treat it as some kind of mystical writing system which is unchangeable and which becomes incomprehensible if it isn't written strictly according to rules established by scribal elites. I'm mentioning this because it's a particularly prevalent attitude in Taiwan, which is exactly why Taiwan still uses the so-called traditional Chinese characters, rather than the simplified characters invented during the Mao era and used by almost everybody else. There's a lot of elitism in Taiwan when it comes to Chinese writing systems, and this obsession with the so-called traditional Chinese characters and the fossilization of the character set as somehow inviolable, unchangeable, and irreformable is connected with a whole raft of political and historical baggage, which is frankly largely the concern of socio-economic elites, rather than the everyday person. To give you an example of how mystified the language system has become, you can even find people who think that if, say, the Chinese character for horse is written with different strokes, then it becomes somehow less horsey and consequently cannot even mean horse. Another example, which is found in popular discourse in Taiwan, is the idea that the traditional Chinese character for love preserves the essential idea and emotion of love because the traditional character contains a component with the meaning heart. In contrast, the simplified character for love has removed the component representing heart. Consequently, some people say the simplified character is insufficient. It can't possibly convey the idea of true love because it's missing the heart, which is, of course, as everybody knows, the source of love. After that, you usually get some fairly politically biased commentary on how the evil communists try to take away people's passion, changing concepts of romance and love to conform to some kind of supposedly spiritless, atheistic communist ideal. On screen now is an image of a video making this argument. And please understand, this is complete nonsense. But this is what happens when the character set is fossilized. This is the kind of obsessive fossilization that I'm talking about. And I want to make it clear that I am not attributing this to Raven at all. It's just a tendency which tends to increase when people become over-fixated on elite forms of writing systems. And I could make an entire video on exactly how this same issue has been treated with the Latin alphabet itself in the history of the Anglosphere. So, getting back to our original subject, it's not like the average Chinese person of the late 19th and early 20th century would look at those Latin letters written in the chop suey font with the curved Chinese-style brushstrokes and be offended by the proportions, or find the characters unreadable, or be confused about why the Latin letters are being written in this unconventional way, or even think that this script is supposed to represent Chinese characters. In fact, we actually have historical evidence demonstrating that the average Chinese immigrant of this era in America wouldn't have been remotely concerned by this script, or even given it very much detailed consideration at all. Raven continues.
The most curved stroke is the go hook stroke, and it's only very slightly bent. So there's a fundamental difference in structure that doesn't naturally translate. As a result, the round letters in chop suey look almost shattered somehow.
Again, since these letters aren't Chinese characters, and since they weren't designed for Chinese readers, this doesn't actually matter. This font isn't trying to represent Chinese characters or a Chinese script. Conclusion. I realize this video may not have covered exactly what you were hoping for, but I wanted to address Linus and Raven's comments on writing systems and the visual impact of the chop suey font separately from the history of the font itself. I thought it was important to cover that first, since it's useful background for when we consider how late 19th century and early 20th century Chinese immigrants to the US would have viewed, interpreted, and interacted with the chop suey font. I'm confident saying they wouldn't have been remotely as concerned by it as today's members of the Chinese diaspora, and they wouldn't have found it remotely incomprehensible, broken, awkward, or even offensive. But that's because they were living in a very different time and socio-cultural environment, and consequently, they had a very different relationship to the font. This does not in any way invalidate the current day opinions of modern members of the Chinese diaspora, who have their own entirely legitimate motivations for their own personal view on this font. In my next video reply to Linus, I'll demonstrate how the chop suey font originated from a Japanese practice of exotifying non-Japanese countries and their alphabets, how wealthy elite members of the Chinese diaspora in San Francisco deliberately co-opted the font in the pursuit of their gentrification project, Chinatown, and how this fits into an overall pattern at the time of immigrants to the US deliberately creating Latin alphabet fonts to mimic the characters used in their own languages. I'll be covering these topics. 1. Origin of the chop suey font. 2. How Chinese elites invented Chinatown. 3. Chop suey was co-opted for gentrification. 4. Immigrant self-representation through fonts. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you'll find the second one equally satisfying.